The wedding hall looked like something out of a dream. Soft golden lights hung from the ceiling like tiny stars, reflecting off crystal glasses and polished silverware. Long white curtains flowed gently along the tall windows, and the air smelled of fresh roses and vanilla candles. Every table was decorated with delicate flower arrangements, and a large arch covered in white orchids stood at the end of the aisle, where the ceremony would take place the next day. Everything was perfect. At least, that's what everyone believed. I stood near the back of the hall, watching my daughter rehearse, walking down the aisle. My hands were clasped tightly in front of me, my heart full of emotions I could barely contain. My daughter, Sophie, looked absolutely radiant even in her simple rehearsal dress. Her long brown hair flowed over her shoulders as she practiced her steps, holding a small bouquet of white lilies. She laughed nervously as the wedding planner adjusted the music. "Okay, Sophie," the planner said cheerfully. "Let's try that again. Walk slowly this time. Tomorrow you'll want to enjoy every moment." Sophie nodded and smiled. Her smile was the same one she had when she was little, bright, warm, and innocent, the kind of smile that made people trust her instantly. I felt tears forming in my eyes. For 26 years, it had always been just the two of us. Her father passed away when she was only 4 years old. After that, I became everything for her: mother, father, teacher, and friend. There were nights when money was tight and days when life felt impossibly hard, but Sophie had always been the light that kept me going. And now she was getting married. Part of me was proud. Part of me was terrified, because letting your child start a new life means learning to step aside. But I believed she had chosen the right man. Daniel. He stood at the front of the aisle during rehearsal, tall and confident in a gray suit. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his smile looked calm and charming as he watched Sophie walk toward him. Everyone liked Daniel. He was successful, polite, and came from a wealthy family. When Sophie first introduced him to me 2 years ago, he brought flowers and spoke respectfully. At the time, I thought my daughter had found someone who would take care of her, someone who would love her. And tomorrow they were supposed to begin there forever. The music stopped and the planner clapped her hands. Perfect, that was beautiful. Guests and family members sitting around the hall applauded lightly. Sophie laughed and walked over to me. "Mom, was that okay?" she asked nervously. I pulled her into a hug. "Okay," I said softly. "You looked like an angel." She smiled, her eyes sparkling. "I can't believe it's finally happening." Neither could I. Across the room, Daniel's mother stood near one of the tables, speaking quietly with a few relatives. Margaret, even saying her name in my mind, made me uncomfortable. She was an elegant woman in her early 60s, always dressed in expensive clothing and jewelry. Her posture was perfect, her smile polite, but there was something about her that always felt cold. From the first day we met, she treated me with subtle distance, never rude, never openly cruel, but always superior. As if she believed Sophie was somehow lucky to marry into their family. I had ignored the feeling for Sophie's sake. After all, sometimes mothers-in-law simply needed time to warm up. Still, tonight Margaret seemed unusually cheerful. She laughed loudly at something Daniel said and patted his shoulder proudly. I watched them for a moment before Sophie squeezed my arm. "Mom, I'm going to help the bridesmaids with the seating chart, of course," I said. She hurried off across the hall, her laughter echoing softly as she joined her friends. For a moment, I simply stood there, watching the room filled with people preparing for tomorrow's celebration. Then my phone vibrated in my purse. I stepped outside the hall to answer it. The evening air was cool and refreshing after the warm lights inside. I spoke briefly with the florist about a small delivery issue and assured them everything was fine. When the call ended, I walked back toward the hall, but as I approached the entrance, I realized I needed to use the restroom first. The hallway beside the ballroom was quiet, lined with storage rooms and supply closets used by the venue staff. My heels clicked softly against the marble floor as I walked down the corridor. That's when I heard voices. At first I barely noticed them, but then I heard a name, Sophie. I slowed down. The voices were coming from a half-closed storage room door. One voice belonged to Daniel, the other belonged to Margaret. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the moment I heard my daughter's name again, something in my chest tightened. I paused beside the door. Inside, Margaret laughed quietly, not a warm laugh, a sharp one. Well, she said, everything is ready for tomorrow. Daniel chuckled. Perfect timing, too. There was a brief pause. Then Margaret said something that made my blood run cold. Once the wedding is official, everything she owns becomes yours. I froze. Daniel replied calmly, almost casually. She won't even realize what happened until it's too late. My heart began pounding so loudly I was afraid they might hear it. Inside the room, Margaret spoke again. You chose well, Daniel. The girl is naive, emotional, exactly the type who signs whatever papers you put in front of her. Daniel laughed. Yes, that little financial agreement she signed last month was the easiest part. My hands started shaking. Financial agreement. Sophie had mentioned signing some documents Daniel said were necessary for wedding planning and property arrangements. She trusted him completely. Margaret's voice grew even colder. Tomorrow will be the best part, she said. Imagine her standing there in front of everyone when you reveal the truth. Daniel snorted. She'll be humiliated. Margaret laughed again. And after the divorce, her house, her savings, everything transfers to you. Silence filled the hallway as the words sank into my mind. They weren't planning a marriage, they were planning a trap, a cruel, calculated trap designed to destroy my daughter. Daniel spoke again, his voice dripping with arrogance. She'll probably cry in front of everyone. Margaret responded with amusement. Oh, I certainly hope so. My heart felt like it had stopped beating. Inside that small storage room, two people were casually discussing how they would ruin my daughter's life. And Sophie had no idea. I slowly stepped away from the door before they could notice my shadow beneath it. My legs felt weak as I walked back down the hallway. The music from the ballroom grew louder as I approached, laughter and conversation echoing through the doors. Everyone inside was celebrating a wedding, but I had just discovered something terrifying. Tomorrow wasn't going to be the happiest day of my daughter's life. It was going to be the day she lost everything, unless I did something first. And as I stood there outside the ballroom doors, one thought formed clearly in my mind. If they wanted to humiliate my daughter in front of everyone then tomorrow, someone else would be humiliated instead. For a few moments, I simply stood in the hallway outside the ballroom doors. The laughter and music from inside sounded distant, almost unreal, like noise coming from another world. My heart was pounding so loudly that I could feel it in my ears. Daniel's words echoed again and again in my mind. Asterisk, once the wedding is official, everything she owns becomes yours. Asterisk, my hands trembled. For years, I had believed my daughter had found someone who loved her. Someone who would build a future with her, protect her, and cherish her the way she deserved. Instead, she had fallen in love with a predator. And his mother was even worse. Slowly, I took a deep breath and forced myself to calm down. Panicking would help no one, especially not Sophie. I pushed open the ballroom doors and stepped back inside. The warm light, the music, the smiling faces, everything looked exactly the same. Guests were chatting happily, waiters were carrying trays of drinks, and the wedding planner was adjusting decorations near the aisle. It was as if the cruel conversation I had just heard didn't exist. Across the room, Sophie stood with her bridesmaids, laughing about something one of them had said. Her eyes sparkled with happiness. Seeing her like that made my chest ache. She had always been trusting, always believing the best in people. When she was 8 years old, she once gave her favorite toy to a girl at school who said she felt lonely. When she was 16, she spent an entire summer volunteering at an animal shelter because she couldn't stand seeing abandoned pets. That was my daughter, kind, gentle, too good for the kind of cruelty Daniel and Margaret were planning. For a brief moment, I considered walking straight to her and telling her everything, but I stopped myself. If Sophie confronted Daniel now, he would simply deny everything. He would act offended, hurt, and confused. And Sophie, who loved him so deeply, might believe him. No. If I wanted to protect my daughter, I needed something stronger than accusations. I needed proof, and I needed a plan. I walked slowly toward one of the empty tables and sat down, pretending to check my phone while my mind raced. First, I had to make sure Sophie stayed safe. Second, I needed to expose Daniel and Margaret in a way they couldn't escape. A quiet anger began building inside me, not the kind that explodes loudly, the kind that grows cold and sharp, the kind that waits. Across the room, Daniel was now speaking with several guests near the bar. He looked relaxed, confident, completely certain that everything tomorrow would go exactly the way he planned. Margaret stood beside him, smiling politely while holding a glass of champagne. Watching them made something inside me harden. They thought my daughter was weak. They thought she was alone. They had no idea what a mother was capable of. Sophie suddenly appeared beside my table. "Mom," she said cheerfully. I quickly forced a smile. "Yes, sweetheart." She sat down across from me, her excitement practically glowing. "Can you believe it's tomorrow?" she said. "I feel like I'm dreaming." I reached across the table and gently took her hand. Her fingers were warm, soft, and familiar, the same little hand I had held when she took her first steps. "You deserve to be happy," I said quietly. She smiled. "Daniel says after the honeymoon we might move into the new house together." My stomach tightened. The house, Sophie had inherited that house from her father. It was the most valuable thing she owned. And now I understood why Daniel had rushed the marriage so quickly. I squeezed her hand slightly. "That sounds exciting." She leaned forward. "Mom, thank you for everything you've done for this wedding. I know it must have been expensive." I shook my head. "Nothing is more important than you." She stood up suddenly. "Oh, I promised the planner I'd check the seating chart again." Before leaving, she bent down and hugged me tightly. "I love you, Mom." My throat tightened. "I love you too." She walked away, disappearing into the crowd of bridesmaids and relatives. The moment she was gone, my smile faded. I sat quietly for several minutes, thinking carefully. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. There was one person I trusted completely, someone who had helped me years ago after my husband passed away. A lawyer named Michael. I stepped outside again and dialed his number. He answered after the second ring. "Hello, Michael," I said quietly. "I need your help." He immediately recognized the seriousness in my voice. "What's wrong?" I glanced back toward the ballroom doors before speaking. "I think someone is trying to trick my daughter into a marriage scam." There was a brief silence. Then Michael spoke firmly. "Tell me everything." So I did. I told him about the conversation I overheard. The financial agreement Sophie had signed. Daniel's plan to take control of her assets after the wedding. Michael listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished, he sighed. "If what you heard is accurate, this could be fraud. Can we stop it?" I asked. "Yes," he said, "but we'll need evidence." Evidence, exactly what I had been thinking. "I might be able to get that," I said slowly. Michael's voice became serious. "Good. Record anything you can. Messages, conversations, documents. If they're really planning something illegal, exposing them publicly could destroy their case." Publicly, an idea began forming in my mind, a dangerous one, but also a perfect one. "I'll call you tomorrow," I said. "Be careful," Michael warned. "I will." When I hung up the phone, the cold anger inside me had fully settled. Daniel and Margaret believed tomorrow would be the day they humiliated my daughter. They imagined her crying in front of hundreds of guests. They imagined taking everything she owned. But their biggest mistake was underestimating one very important thing. A mother protecting her child. I walked back into the ballroom slowly. The rehearsal dinner was beginning now. Guests were taking their seats while waiters brought out the first dishes. At the center table sat Daniel and Margaret. Daniel noticed me watching, and raised his glass politely. I returned the gesture with a small smile. Inside, however, my mind was already several steps ahead, because tomorrow morning I would start putting my plan into action. And if everything worked the way I intended, my daughter would never walk down that aisle, but Daniel and Margaret would still receive a wedding surprise they would never forget. The morning of the wedding arrived bright and calm. Sunlight poured through the large windows of the bridal suite, painting the room with warm golden light. Outside, the venue gardens looked like a painting. White chairs lined the aisle. Flowers decorated every corner, and soft music floated through the air as staff members made their final preparations. Everything looked perfect, exactly the way Daniel and his mother wanted it, except for one small detail. The bride wasn't there, but no one knew that yet. Earlier that morning, Sophie and I had left the house together. She was excited, nervous, and talking non-stop about the ceremony. "I can't believe I'm getting married today," she kept saying. I smiled and nodded, hiding the storm of thoughts inside my mind. Instead of going directly to the venue, I had convinced her to stop somewhere first. A relaxing morning before the ceremony, I told her, every bride deserves a calm start, so we went to a quiet spa on the other side of town. Sophie loved the idea. She had no reason to suspect anything. While she was enjoying a massage and facial treatment, I stepped outside and made several important phone calls. First to Michael, the lawyer. Second to someone else. Someone who would make sure justice was served if Daniel and Margaret tried to deny their actions. By the time I returned inside, my plan was fully in motion. Sophie looked refreshed and happy when her appointment finished. "Mom, that was amazing," she said, stretching her arms. "I feel so relaxed now." I smiled. "Good. You deserve it." We sat together in the lounge area for a while, drinking tea. Then I gently placed my hand over hers. "Sophie," I said softly, "there's something I want you to trust me about." She looked curious but calm. "Of course, no matter what happens today," I continued, "remember that I love you more than anything in this world." Her eyes softened. "Mom, why are you saying that?" I took a deep breath, because sometimes life surprises us, and sometimes those surprises protect us. She studied my face carefully. But Sophie had always trusted me completely, so she simply nodded. "Okay." I hugged her tightly. At that moment, I knew my daughter would be safe. Meanwhile, back at the wedding venue, the ceremony was supposed to begin at 4:00 p.m. By 3:30 p.m., the hall was full of guests. Elegant dresses shimmered under the lights, glasses clinked together, and quiet conversations filled the air. The large wedding cake stood proudly on a decorated table near the center of the hall. 3 tiers of white frosting, roses, and golden ribbons. Everything looked ready for the bride. Daniel stood at the altar, adjusting his tie. He looked confident, calm, and slightly impatient. Next to him stood Margaret, watching the entrance doors like a hawk. "Where is she?" she muttered quietly. Daniel shrugged. "Relax, Mom. Brides are always late." But as the minutes passed, his confidence slowly began to fade. 3:50 p.m., still no bride. Guests began whispering among themselves. Some checked their watches. Others glanced toward the entrance. Margaret's smile grew tighter. "Call her," she snapped. Daniel pulled out his phone and dialed Sophie's number. No answer. He tried again. Still nothing. Now Margaret's irritation turned into anger. This girl better not be doing something stupid. 4:05 p.m. The ceremony was now officially late. The wedding planner nervously approached Daniel. "Should we delay a few minutes?" she asked. Daniel forced a smile. Yes, just a few minutes. But inside, he was beginning to feel something he hadn't expected. Worry, Margaret pulled out her own phone and dialed my number. Across town, I was sitting calmly in a quiet cafe. My phone buzzed. "Margaret," I answered. "Hello." Her voice exploded through the speaker. "Where is your little brat?" I slowly took a sip of my tea before replying. "I'm sorry. Don't play games with me," she snapped. "Everyone is here. The guests are waiting. Where is Sophie?" For a moment I said nothing. Then I laughed, a soft, calm laugh. Margaret went silent. What's so funny?" she demanded. I leaned back in my chair. "Oh, Margaret," I said casually, "you shouldn't worry about Sophie right now." Her voice grew sharper. "What does that mean?" I smiled slightly. "Maybe you should check under the table with the wedding cake." There was a pause. "A table?" she repeated. "Yes," I said calmly, "the big one in the middle of the hall." Margaret sounded irritated. "This is ridiculous. Go look," I replied. Then I hung up. Back at the venue, Margaret stared at her phone in disbelief. Daniel approached her. "What did she say?" Margaret frowned. "She told me to look under the cake table." Daniel blinked. "What? I don't know," she snapped, "but I'm going to find out." Guests watched curiously as Margaret marched across the hall toward the large decorated cake. Daniel followed behind her. Whispers spread through the crowd. Margaret reached the table and bent down slightly, pulling back the long white tablecloth. For a moment she said nothing. Then her entire face turned pale. Her eyes widened, and suddenly she screamed. The sound echoed through the entire hall. Guests jumped from their seats. Daniel rushed forward. "Mom, what happened?" Margaret slowly backed away from the table, shaking. Underneath the cake table sat a small black box, locked. Attached to it was a bright red envelope. Daniel carefully picked it up. Across the front of the envelope were 4 words written in bold letters. Asterisk, asterisk, play this for everyone. Asterisk, asterisk, Daniel's heart began to pound. Because suddenly something about this wedding felt very, very wrong. For several seconds, the entire wedding hall stood frozen in silence. Margaret's scream still echoed faintly through the room as the guests stared at the cake table in confusion. Some people stood up from their chairs, whispering to each other, while others craned their necks to see what had caused such a dramatic reaction. Daniel held the red envelope in his hand. His fingers tightened around it. Across the front were the words written in thick black ink. Asterisk, asterisk, play this for everyone. Asterisk, asterisk, his jaw clenched. "What kind of stupid joke is this?" he muttered. Margaret's face had turned ghostly pale. Her eyes were locked on the small black box sitting under the table as if it were something dangerous. "What's inside it?" one of the guests asked nervously. The wedding planner stepped closer, clearly unsure what to do. Daniel looked around the room. Hundreds of eyes were now watching him. He forced a small laugh. "It's probably some surprise Sophie planned," he said loudly. "You know how brides like dramatic moments." A few guests chuckled awkwardly, but something in Daniel's voice sounded strained. He crouched down and pulled the black box out from beneath the table. It wasn't very large, but it was heavy. Attached to it was a small speaker and a digital recorder. Margaret's breathing became uneven. "Daniel," she whispered. "Maybe we shouldn't." But Daniel had already opened the red envelope. Inside was a single note. He read it quickly. His face slowly lost all color. "What does it say?" Margaret asked sharply. Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he turned the box around and noticed a button labeled asterisk asterisk play asterisk asterisk. Guests leaned forward in their chairs. The room had grown completely silent. "Go on." Someone called from the back. "Play it." Daniel swallowed hard. His instincts told him something was very wrong. But now there was no way to stop. Too many people were watching. Slowly, reluctantly, he pressed the button. At first, there was only a faint crackling sound through the speaker. Then a voice filled the hall. Margaret's voice, clear, cruel, laughing. "Well," the recording said, "everything is ready for tomorrow." The effect was instant. Margaret's eyes widened in horror. Daniel's body went completely rigid. From the speaker, his own voice responded. Perfect timing, too. A murmur spread through the crowd. Some guests looked confused. Others began exchanging uneasy glances. The recording continued. "Once the wedding is official," Margaret's voice said coldly, "everything she owns becomes yours." Gasps erupted around the room. Daniel's voice followed. "She won't even realize what happened until it's too late." Someone in the audience whispered, "What is this?" The speaker crackled again. "You chose well, Daniel." Margaret's voice continued. "The girl is naive, emotional, exactly the type who signs whatever papers you put in front of her." Daniel's recorded laughter echoed through the hall. "Yes, That little financial agreement she signed last month was the easiest part. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. A woman covered her mouth. A man stood up abruptly from his chair. The recording wasn't finished. Tomorrow will be the best part, Margaret said in the audio. Imagine her standing there in front of everyone when you reveal the truth. Daniel's voice replied with amusement. She'll be humiliated. Margaret laughed, and after the divorce, her house, her savings, everything transfers to you. The recording ended. Silence, heavy, shocking, unavoidable silence. All eyes turned toward Daniel and Margaret. Their carefully built masks had completely shattered. Margaret's lips trembled. Daniel looked like someone had drained the life from his body. No, he stammered. This is fake. But even as he spoke, the doors of the wedding hall slowly opened. 2 police officers stepped inside. Behind them, I walked in calmly. The room parted as I moved forward. Margaret stared at me with disbelief. She choked. You did this? I stopped a few feet away from her. Yes, I said quietly. The officers walked toward Daniel. We need to ask you a few questions. One of them said firmly. Daniel panicked. This is ridiculous. It's just a recording of a fraud conspiracy. The officer replied calmly. The guests began whispering even louder now. Phones appeared everywhere as people started recording the unfolding scene. Margaret's composure finally shattered. You ruined everything, she screamed at me. I looked at her without anger. Only calm. No, I said softly. You did. Daniel tried one last desperate attempt. Where is Sophie? He demanded. I met his eyes. Safe. That single word seemed to crush him more than anything else. She trusted you. I continued quietly. She loved you, and you planned to destroy her life. Margaret shook with rage. You think you've won, she hissed. I gave a small, peaceful smile. No. Then I gestured toward the guests. My daughter won. Around the room, people were shaking their heads in disgust. The wedding that was meant to humiliate Sophie had turned into a public exposure of Daniel and Margaret's cruelty. The officers escorted Daniel toward the exit. Margaret followed, shouting protests that no one believed. Within minutes, the hall that was supposed to host a wedding had turned into the scene of their complete humiliation. Later that evening, I returned home. Sophie was sitting on the couch, still wearing comfortable clothes from the spa, completely unaware of the chaos that had unfolded. When she saw me, she stood up. Mom, what happened? I sat beside her and gently took her hands. Then I told her everything. The conversation, the plan, the trap they had prepared for her. At first, she sat there in stunned silence. Then tears slowly filled her eyes, not tears of heartbreak, tears of realization. You saved me, she whispered. I hugged her tightly. I just protected what matters most to me. She held me for a long time. Finally, she said quietly, I don't even want to imagine what would have happened if you hadn't heard them. I kissed her forehead. A mother hears the things the world tries to hide. Outside, the night was peaceful. The wedding that was supposed to destroy my daughter's life had never happened. And as I held her in my arms, I knew one thing for certain. No matter how cruel the world could be, a mother's love would always be stronger. Red.